Are you familiar with the Mary Sue archetype? A Mary Sue is a type of character that must never have any flaws or weaknesses and is always the most powerful and perfect member of the group. If you don't know why this is one of the most annoying character types ever, you're about to find out. Roll post. Hi folks, please strap in for a story of a toxic player that my friends and I put up with for 2 whole years. Call her Sue for anonymity's sake. I'm going to preface this with something about her. She's not a great person away from the table. Compiling all the things that made her awful would take forever, but I can sum it up in a quick list so you get an idea of what her personality was like. Sue was racist. One of our players is a second-generation immigrant, and some nasty things were said to her in relation to immigrants. Sue was transphobic and homophobic. Everyone in the group is some flavor of LGBTQ+, including her, but she was the fun brand of homophobic, where she couldn't stand gay/bisexual men. The transphobia was directed at me too, and 2 other friends of mine, with misgendering out the wazoo and some other fun comments. Sue had anger issues. Any perceived criticism on something she enjoyed or partook in was a personal attack that led to yelling and guilt tripping. She also had fun screaming matches with her father during our Discord run sessions. Sue refused to separate herself from her characters. If you disliked her character, whether as the player or another character, it was the same as disliking her, and you were at fault and were made to feel horrible through all sorts of guilt tripping. At this point, you're probably wondering how Sue lasted 2 years. It's simple. Everyone else at the table had the unfortunate problem of thinking, maybe it's just me who's bothered by this, and never saying anything, not wanting to create problems out of nothing. Most of us are non-confrontational, which led to this fun mess. Now to get to the tabletop bits, since that's what we're all really here for. As said earlier, Sue joined our group 2 years ago when the DMs at the time, Stefan, who was looking to replace a player we had to kick, a horror story for another day, she was among the 3 people who applied. All 3 were looking good, and since our group was tiny, only 4 people including myself, we invited them all. Things were fine. The campaign went without a hitch. Her character was an edgy sniper assassin. Some of Sue's anger issues started to show, with her threatening violence against a character for becoming romantically involved with another party member. But we assumed it was part of the assassin's character and didn't dwell on it. Campaign ends. Woohoo! On to the next one. There really isn't a good way to describe Sue's next character. She rolled up a Genasi monk, background of entertainer. Went with the dancer trope. It all sounds good on paper, but then the campaign starts. She comes out with this really cutesy, high-pitched and childlike voice. Odd, but we assume she's young. Then she rolls out that her monk is older than the majority of the party, save for 2 middle-aged characters. Out of the blue, she also establishes that, since her monk was a dancer, she'd had, quote, a lot of sex with a lot of people as she traveled and performed. Not something that we would have an issue with if not for the fact that her character was constantly portrayed with this weird innocence, talking like a child, barely dipping her toes into puberty. It creeped me out, and it creeped the rest of the group out as I later learned. We did what non-confrontational people did best and tried to ignore it, succeeding for the most part, except for when Sue would chime in with in-character sexual innuendo and meted her monk into an extremely sexual relationship with the daughter of one of the aforementioned middle-aged characters post-campaign, not consulting the DM or the player, just stating that it happened during the epilogue session. Simultaneously with that campaign, I start a different campaign that consists of connected one-shots. It's mostly to allow my friends to experiment with different class types they haven't dabbled in before. Great in concept, except I was an absolute fool and invited Sue to join. It ended up being a large party of 7 players, which was fine since usually only 4 or 5 could make it per session. Sue created a tiefling druid. Everything seemed fine. The group was goofy for the most part, more focused on having fun than anything else. But Sue couldn't let that sit and designated herself the party leader. And heaven forbid you contested her in any way. My friend Eli learned this the hard way with his human rogue. The insults and racism flung from Sue's druid at the rogue were enough to make anyone uncomfortable. If you mess this up, I'll kill you, or that's just like a human to act this way. Fine, go and be stupid. The rest of us are going to do something actually productive. It got to the point where Eli's girlfriend left the table to escape it, at the same time citing work conflicts, but again, later revealed to be because of Sue. Eventually, Sue retires this druid to try out a paladin. This brings out her seemingly favorite character trope, an innocent, high-class woman who is also extremely sexual and violent. Her paladin acted very chaste and inexperienced, but at the same time constantly made allusions to bondage, sadism, and other niche sexual kinks. This was also where Sue began to target Eli with something arguably worse with in-character verbal harassment. She began to, out of character, sexually harass Eli about how much she wanted to have sex with his tiefling monk character. This naturally made Eli extremely uncomfortable. So much so that when the monk met a premature death, he didn't roll a new character, and instead dipped out of the campaign. I was unaware of the extent of these sexual comments at the time, and to this day regret not kicking her then and there. The one-shot campaign ended without much else of note, but tensions were starting to rise. I picked up a module campaign set in the Underdark and naively asked the remaining players, Sue included, if they wanted to start that one next. Naturally, everyone said yes, and that's when it all started to slowly boil over. This was just the first year. I don't want to go on forever, so I'll include the second year and conclusion in a separate post. TLDR, a toxic player joins the group, gradually starts to show her true colors of being racist, anger issue riddled, and overall unpleasant to play with. End post. So what we can already get from this is that this Sue character either lacks the self-awareness or the ability to care about anyone other than herself. Between metagaming, making characters that make no sense, and treating everyone else at the table, especially Eli, like objects to be used for her own pleasure or gain. It's not every story that I come across a that guy, or in this case that girl, that is genuinely despicable in and out of game, but here we are. But, as is usually true with these stories, her behavior gets even worse in the second part. Roll post. A continuation of the last post. Welcome back. This part here covering the second year of Sue will have the most details. Why? As of me writing this, Sue was kicked out of our group 2 weeks ago. That's right, this nightmare only just ended for my group. Now, to preface with 2 more things. The details following cover the campaign I'm running as a DM, and another campaign that I'm a player in, run by Stefan, the DM of the campaign mentioned in the first part. These campaigns are both continuing on up until the end of this story, although mine began before the other. I'll start with my campaign, Underdark-oriented module involving a demon incursion. My friends roll up unique characters as always, and everything is looking good. Then, Sue messages me about character creation. Sue: hey, I want to make a drow wizard. Me: okay, sounds cool, but I want her to be blind. Alright, I suppose I can make that work. She can cast spells by seeing through her familiar. I also want her to be the youngest of a drow matriarch. You selected the cloistered scholar background, didn't you? She's kept hidden away out of shame for her blindness. Me, knowing the module doesn't allow for much background implementation. Alright, I can work with that. She won't have the noble features, just so you know. Ah, okay. Right away, I'm getting a bit concerned, but I brush it off, like a fool, since Sue didn't put up too much of a fight. Then comes the game itself. Their initial goal is simple, but takes up almost 7 months of real time. Escape the Underdark. Already Sue is leaning towards her favorite character type, sheltered and naive, yet continuously making tentacle jokes over one of her wizard spells. We aren't prudes, but it stops being funny the 15th time it happens, and flirting with other party members about things that her character shouldn't, by her own standards, know about. There also were moments where she had her wizard threaten to torture NPCs to get what she wanted, acting like a stereotypical drow matriarch, which she stressed during character creation, was something her wizard was appalled by and refused to turn out like. This was a good aligned party, so threats of torture didn't fly with anyone in the group, but it kept happening. Otherwise, I won't be mentioning it. It ended up being a constant tension point throughout the campaign. Pause post. This is where I need to point out that this is a situation in which a session 0 would have been very useful. The party could have explained that they're the good guys in this game and that behaving like a chaotic evil demon just won't do. I doubt it would have stopped Sue from acting up, but it would have been really useful to be able to tell her to her face that she is breaking agreed upon rules. It also would have served as a sort of justifiable reason to kick her out gently if need be. You break the rules, you get the boot. I'm not criticizing OP so much as I am informing you. Session 0's work, make use of them. Roll post. Eventually, one of the characters die and the player, Callie, sets up a new one. A half-orc ranger, barely an adult even by orc standards. And the group likes her more than the old character, especially Sue. In fact, she starts having her wizard flirt with the ranger. No one thinks much of it until Sue mentions that her wizard is well over 280 years old. The equivalent of her late 20s, early 30s for an elf in this setting. I won't explain how someone mentally years more developed, by at least 2 centuries in this case, flirting with someone who just became an adult is gross. The flirting is shut down very shortly after that, mostly by Callie but also by myself and Stephen. Much to Sue's confusion and frustration, Sue herself was in her late 20s, but she saw no problem with any of this. The rest of the group consisted of folks of ages varying from 19 to 31. Everyone but Sue knew it wasn't okay. We move past it as best we can, but Sue isn't done making the sessions frustrating to deal with. Despite her wizard being the youngest of her family and flirting with the youngest member of the party, Sue decided that she was the party mom. This was far from the truth, but she wanted to use that title as an excuse to be overbearing and bossy. Once more, she tried to wrestle the leadership role from anyone who tried to take it, before veering sharply into main character syndrome. Sue made a melee wizard, using the Bladesong subclass. She didn't put the constitution into her wizard for this, and as a result had very low hit points. And, being a wizard, her strength was low. This led to some naturally difficult situations where she would send her wizard right into the thick of combat and be frustrated when I had enemies attack her and half her HP within 2 rounds. As she was in melee more often, she got attacks against her more often. I ended up rolling a large amount of nat 20s against her. This is something I heard from another player, but apparently she would constantly complain in private messages about how every time OP crits against me, it feels so personal. I want to say that she didn't expect me to fudge any rolls against her, but I wouldn't put it past her to want that, especially after how she had no less than 2 panic attacks and rage quits over the possibility of her character dying. After one session, after I alluded to the next one being an in-game 10-hour trek through a magma chamber, she messaged me saying how she, quote, didn't think she could handle the stress of the next meet, and how she won't be able to play if her character's going to die. I dedicated 20 minutes of my life talking her down from her own crisis that, in the end, wasn't even a huge deal. That gets to more fun main character syndrome moments. She played a wizard and naturally had a lot of spells on hand, but most of them were for combat and not utility. I like to balance the challenges, and sometimes I threw in environmental puzzles at the group for them to figure out. Well, Sue decided that, because she couldn't solve them with a single spell, she hated them, and would complain the entire time the party was trying to work. And that was just in my campaign. Fast forward to 6 months ago. Stephen is starting up a new campaign, one of the more recently released Wizards of the Coast modules. We're all fairly excited, coming off level 15 characters and ready to jump into a new group dynamic with everyone switching up what class they were going for. These are the important characters for the most frustrating part of the Sue story. Tyler, a druid, Kaija, a ranger, Rhonda, a cleric, myself, a rogue, and Sue, a paladin. The main problem didn't start until a couple levels in, but there were a couple warning signs for a storm that was brewing. Sue created a paladin but gave her anger issues and played her as a barbarian. When we asked her why, after she got frustrated during a session over her paladin not being as effective in combat, she said, "Oh, I built her thinking that she might fall eventually and have to reclass. Lol." Yeah, I felt the same thing you're feeling right now reading that. Pause post really quick. I would just like to acknowledge how hilariously bad it is that she cares too much about things that don't matter and doesn't care at all about things that do matter. Here's a list of things that matter a little bit too much to her. Getting hit in combat. Getting to be the main character. Making sure that everyone knows that she's God's favorite cherub. And her character dying. Now, here's a list of things that don't matter at all to her. Somehow, also her character dying, other people's boundaries, understanding the game, and how her actions negatively impact everybody around her. It's so completely upside down that it's almost comical. I just wanted to point that out anyways. Roll post. We continue along the plot, and we hit some character conflict along the way. An undead priest NPC was assisting us, and Sue's paladin was doing the standard, "I'm a paladin, and any undead is evil, and I must destroy it" routine. We managed to convince her to not attack the priest and attempted to continue, but the paladin was defensive after that, saying that it was in her nature, in Aasimar, to want to destroy all undead. Kaija's ranger, a feral tiefling, replied, "Well, if I were to go with my nature, I would have attacked you all, so you can't use your nature as an excuse." Sue did not like that at all. It resulted in one of Sue's worst blow-ups we'd ever seen, threatening the ranger, once again getting defensive, and overall writing him off. The rest of us weren't sure how to react, but all of us were on the side of the ranger, if not open about it, including my rogue. The session ended shortly after that, and Sue had noticed that the party all sided with the ranger, and she was not a fan of that one bit. So she slipped into some of our private messages going, "Woe is me," over how no one in the party liked her paladin, and how she was just doing what her character would do, and she couldn't understand why no one liked her. Despite us trying to assure her that inter-party conflict happened and it wasn't something to get worked up over, Sue wouldn't hear it. She messaged Stephen, and less than a session later, she was sending her paladin off to swap in with a new character, a warlock. This might have been fine if her warlock wasn't worse than the paladin. What she lacked in anger issues, she made up for in not caring. The main plot did not concern her, she was just around for a laugh. Stop post for me to make a quick bet if anyone wants in. I'm going to predict that she's only making this warlock as revenge. She's angry about how she perceives everyone else to be treating her, so she's making this character specifically to be a drawn-out tantrum. Roll post. Whenever the party would talk about things in roleplay, Sue constantly would chime in about how her warlock was not interested in emotions and was bored. Well, after hearing that over several sessions, we all decided that trying to get to know the warlock wasn't worth it if she didn't actually care. And we stopped trying to make friends with her. Again, Sue did not like that, but there was no way Stephen would let her swap in a third character, so she was stuck with her warlock until she decided to bring the paladin back. Yes, the warlock was always intended to be temporary. DM Stephen wasn't that thrilled. Now for the main issue. Sue was very attracted to my rogue both in and out of character. I created a tiefling and I lost count of the messages I got both during and after games talking about how much she loved their horns and their tail. I tried to laugh it off. Surely Sue wasn't actually horny for my character. It was one thing to acknowledge that a character's attractive, but it's a whole nother ballpark to get bothered by them, right? Right? I was incorrect. I had no idea how incorrect I was until my rogue and Kaija's ranger got together. It took 3 months of weekly sessions to develop feelings and 2 more for them to acknowledge it and start dating. I only say this to let you know that this was not a sudden event. Sue would get grouchy during the moments the two interacted. She tried to shift gears with her warlock, attempting to romance the druid until Tyler firmly cemented, both in and out of character, that his druid was not interested in a relationship that wasn't platonic. Then she caved and asked Stephen to bring her paladin back, planning on romancing Rhonda's cleric instead, who had previously developed a crush on the paladin but was shut down, likely due to Sue wanting the paladin and my rogue to end up together. The cleric has since moved on. Paladin returns after an intense combat session to a mixed reaction by the party. Again, Sue got angry, particularly at my rogue for some reason, even though the rogue was just a demon trying to impersonate their dead sister and was shaken up by that. The ranger was understandably not thrilled as they hadn't parted on great terms, and the rest of the party was mildly enthusiastic. Sue messaged Rhonda after the meeting complaining about my rogue's reaction, saying, "I can't be committed to OP's character if they show no interest in mine." The icing on this cake was when Kaija and I were talking about our characters out of game, particularly their relationship. Sue decided to chime in. "Sue, rogue has such terrible taste, even more than paladin." Me, "Oh, rogue is infamous for their terrible taste. Ranger is the first smart decision they've made in years." Sue, "Ranger is also a terrible decision." Kaija, "Hey, no, Ranger is great." Me, "Ranger has been excellent for rogue." Sue, "Ranger is a dick." Me, "So is rogue, a match made in heaven." Kaija, "Ranger is a dick to paladin." Sue, "Over a small disagreement." Kaija, "Hey, you don't know his backstory, it's more than mild to him." Sue, "Yet rogue makes a deal with the devil, and after one chat they're dating in the end." Me, "That wasn't how it went, but hey, that's your opinion. I think they're a great match." The final event that put the nail in the coffin, for me at least, was Sue messaging me and saying, "You know, the reason paladin is attracted to rogue is because they're a constant temptation. Like a piece of candy she can't eat." Gross. As the campaigns went on, Sue would complain about more and more things while simultaneously being hypocritical. Character choices made by characters in the group, never adversely affecting the party, were harshly reprimanded, while no one was allowed to say a disapproving word when she would do what her character would do and impact the entire group with her choices, or just insult another character. I set up a new chat for an upcoming campaign, and I invited everyone but Sue. In each invite message, I explained that I wasn't inviting Sue, and for no one to mention the campaign to her. It was my hope that once the 2 campaigns ended, we could quietly sever ties with her and let this bad experience fade into the night. But my stating that I wasn't bringing Sue to the table again opened the floodgates. Everyone at our table had issues with her. We spoke up about the things that bothered us and were delightfully surprised to learn that our issues with Sue were not, in fact, something we were alone in. The final session came. It was for the campaign I ran, and tensions were already high. None of us wanted to deal with Sue anymore, but the thought of kicking her was too daunting. Then the game started, and Sue acted like Sue, complaining about the situation and getting angry that she couldn't solve a puzzle with brute force or a single spell. Stephen snapped at her, and shortly after, Sue decided to dip out early. The mood shift after she left was immediate, and once the session was over, we knew what had to be done. We wrote up a message explaining how her behavior and attitude at the table was not healthy, and that as a result of it, we were not having fun and she was no longer welcome at our tables. We sent the message and promptly kicked her out of both campaigns. Everyone but the message sender blocked her on all social medias because we knew she would either go on a rampage or try and guilt her way back into the group. We were right about the latter. Callie was the one who took the bullet sending the message and blocked her as well after getting over a dozen confirmation messages that Sue knew she was kicked. And just like that, our Sue nightmare was over. Games since then are much more fun. TLDR, Toxic Nightmare Mary Sue player is angry when she can't solve all party problems, and when her character doesn't get her piece of candy, she complains about it constantly and ruins the overall mood. We eventually boot her from both campaigns and live happily ever after. End post. Well, I'm glad there was a happy ending. Surprising how good the ending was for a story with such a bad antagonist. It's not super often we get those. Anyways, I'ma head out. These two videos right here should keep you busy while I'm gone. Till next time.